There is a word in the Bible that has been so thoroughly misunderstood, so completely repackaged by modern culture, that most people who use it every single day have almost no idea what it actually means. The word is faith. And here is the problem. If you grew up in a church, or near a church, or anywhere in the Western world, you were handed a definition of faith that sounds something like this. Faith is believing something very hard, especially when you have no evidence for it. Faith is the feeling of certainty. Faith is the opposite of doubt. Faith is what you do when the facts run out. And if you have tried to live on that definition, you already know that it does not hold, because that kind of faith is exhausting. It turns the spiritual life into a performance, into a mental straining exercise where you try to squeeze more certainty out of yourself, try to silence the questions, try to feel something you are not sure you actually feel. And when the doubt comes, and it always comes, you assume the problem is you, that you do not have enough, that you need to believe harder. But here is what the Bible actually says faith is. And it is not that. Not even close. The word translated faith in the New Testament is the Greek word times pistis, and times pistis times does not primarily mean a feeling. It does not mean certainty. It does not mean the absence of doubt. Pistis times means trust. Specifically, it means the kind of trust that moves, the kind of trust that does something, the kind of trust that is so settled in its object that it rearranges how you live. The distinction sounds small. It is not. Feeling is internal. You can feel certain about something and do nothing about it. Trust is relational. It connects two parties. It is always directed at someone or something outside yourself. You cannot trust in a vacuum. You trust someone. And this is the crack in the foundation of the modern definition. Because modern faith is almost entirely about the interior state of the believer. How strongly do you feel it? How much certainty can you generate? It turns faith inward. But the Bible's definition is almost entirely about the object. Not how strongly you hold on, but what or who you are holding on to. That shift changes everything. The most important passage on faith in the entire Bible is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And most people have memorized a translation of it that, while beautiful, loses something critical in the English. Most translations render it like this. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And that sounds profound. But the two key words, substance and evidence, are translations of Greek words that do not mean what we think they mean. The first word is times hypostasis. It is a legal and commercial term in the ancient world. It meant the title deed to a property, the document that gave you standing to claim something that was not yet in your physical possession. The second word is times elenkos. It is a courtroom word. It meant the evidence that makes a case, the kind of evidence that produces a conviction, not a feeling, not an impression, an argument that holds up under examination. So, a more precise translation of Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 would be something like this. Faith is the title deed of things hoped for, the legal proof of things not seen. This is not mystical. This is not anti-intellectual. This is property law. If you own land you have never stood on, you own it because a document says so. The document is real even when the land feels distant. Your ownership is not measured by how strongly you feel about the land. It is measured by whether the deed is valid. That is what Hebrews is saying faith is, the document, the standing, the ground on which you plant your feet and say, this is real, this belongs to me, and I am going to live accordingly. But here is where it gets even more interesting, because the author of Hebrews did not just give a definition and move on, they immediately gave 11 chapters of examples, a gallery of real people who had this kind of faith. And when you actually look at those people, you discover something that the performance-based definition of faith cannot account for. Every single person in Hebrews 11 acted before they saw, not felt before they saw, not believed harder before they saw, acted. Noah built a boat, 120 years of construction, in a world that had never seen rain. Genesis 6 does not describe a man trembling with mystical certainty. It describes a man with a hammer and timber and a very long timeline. Abraham left. He did not know where he was going. Genesis 12 says he went out, not knowing. The faith came before the map. He trusted a voice and moved his household across the ancient Near East without a destination address. The midwives in Egypt, their names are Shiphrah and Puah, and they appear in Exodus chapter 1-2 verses that most people skip over. They defied Pharaoh's order to kill Hebrew infant boys. Not because they had a feeling, because they feared God more than they feared the most powerful man on earth. And they acted on that fear before they knew how it would turn out. Rahab hid the spies. She was a Canaanite, a prostitute, an outsider to everything Israel represented, and she told the spies something that should stop you cold. She said, "We have heard what your God did at the Red Sea." She had heard about it. She had not witnessed it. She had no direct experience. But she believed the report was true. And then, and this is the part that matters, she hung a scarlet cord from her window and reorganized her entire family's survival around a promise made by strangers. That is times pistis. Information received, trust placed, action taken. This is the part of the conversation that usually makes people uncomfortable. Because if faith is trust that moves, then faith is something you can observe. It leaves tracks. It changes behavior. It shows up in the decisions you make, the money you spend, the risks you take, the people you protect. And that makes it impossible to fake, at least for long. You can perform certainty. You can use the right language, sing the right songs, raise your hands at the right moments, and tell everyone around you that your faith is strong. And nobody in the room can see inside your chest. But trust? Trust exposes itself eventually. Because trust is not about what you say about the bridge. Trust is about whether you walk across it. James understood this, and his letter, which sits in uneasy tension with Paul's letters for people who read them without understanding what each man was actually arguing about, addresses this head-on. James chapter 2, verse 17. Faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. This has been misread for centuries, as James contradicting Paul, as works-based salvation sneaking back in through the side door. But James is not talking about how you get right with God. He is talking about how you identify real faith when you see it. A person who says they trust God but whose life shows no evidence of that trust, James says that is not faith. That is vocabulary. It is the language of faith without the content. It is claiming to own the deed without ever having received it. The word James uses for dead is the Greek times nekra. Corpse dead, not weak, not sleeping, not in need of encouragement, dead. Real trust in a real God rearranges real life. Not perfectly, not all at once, but directionally, persistently, in ways that cost something. Now here is the place where the modern church has gotten itself into serious trouble. Because somewhere along the way, and this happened gradually, across multiple generations, faith got separated from its object and became a commodity in itself. You have probably heard it said this way: someone is sick, the prayer is offered, and then comes the qualifier, if you have enough faith. Or a financial need arises, and someone suggests, you just need to believe God for it. Or a tragedy occurs, and someone, meaning well, says, you have to have faith that God is in control. And in each of those cases, the word faith is being used as though faith itself is the operative force, as though faith is the power, as though what you need more of is not a clearer understanding of who God is and what He has promised, but simply a larger quantity of this interior substance called faith. But that is not what the Bible teaches. And when you watch it play out in real people's lives, you see the damage it does. Because when the healing does not come, the conclusion is, your faith was not strong enough. When the provision does not arrive, the conclusion is, you did not believe hard enough. When the tragedy happens anyway, the conclusion is, something was wrong with your trust. And the person is left not with a stronger relationship with God, but with a crushing sense of personal failure. They did not produce enough of the feeling. They could not generate enough of the interior certainty. And therefore, whatever went wrong is, at some level, their fault. This is a theological disaster dressed in spiritual language, because Jesus, the one who is supposed to be the author and finisher of faith, which is how Hebrews chapter 12 verse 2 describes him. Jesus himself never once told anyone their faith was too small, and therefore they could not be helped. He healed the man whose friends lowered him through a roof. He saw their faith, not a mystical quantity of interior certainty. He saw action. He saw 4 people who cared enough about their friend to tear open a stranger's ceiling and lower him on a mat. He healed the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She did not have a theological conversation with him first. She pressed through a crowd and touched the hem of his robe. That was her faith, a decision, a movement, a body moving toward the only source of help she had left. He commended the centurion, a Roman soldier, a Gentile, a man with no formal standing in the covenant community, and said he had not found faith like this in all of Israel. Why? Because the centurion understood authority. He understood that Jesus did not need to physically show up. A word was enough, and he structured his request around that understanding. In every case, the faith Jesus responds to is trust directed at him. Not a quantity of interior feeling, not the volume of certainty, trust, aimed at a specific person with specific authority and specific promises. The size of the faith is almost irrelevant. Jesus said faith the size of a mustard seed, the smallest seed a first-century farmer would have known moves mountains. The mustard seed does not move the mountain by being large. It moves the mountain by being connected to the right source of power. So, what does this mean practically? What does it look like to have biblical faith, this times pistis, this trust that moves when you are standing in the middle of something that is not working out? The most honest answer in the entire Bible comes from a man named Thomas. Thomas has been given one of the worst reputations in all of church history. Doubting Thomas, the disciple who would not believe without proof. The cautionary tale about weak faith, but read the story again carefully. When Jesus appeared to the disciples after the resurrection, and Thomas was not there, the others told him what they had seen. And Thomas said, John chapter 20, verse 25, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." That is not the language of a man who wanted to disbelieve. That is the language of a man who desperately wanted it to be true and was terrified of being wrong. He had watched Jesus die. He had seen the nails. He needed more than secondhand testimony to reorganize his entire world around the resurrection. A week later, Jesus appeared again, and this time Thomas was in the room. And Jesus did not rebuke him. He walked directly toward him, and he said, verse 27, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believe." Jesus came to Thomas. He met him in his doubt. He offered him the exact evidence Thomas had said he needed. And Thomas, in the moment that follows, makes the highest declaration of faith in the entire Gospel of John. He does not need to touch. He sees Jesus, and he says, "My Lord and my God." That is times pistis. Not certainty generated from the inside. Trust placed in a person who showed up. And what Jesus says immediately after should be heard carefully. He said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." He is not criticizing Thomas. He is pointing forward. To the millions of people who would come after, who would not have a room to walk into, who would not have wounds to touch, who would have to place their trust in testimony, in a document, in a title deed, and who would nonetheless reorganize their lives around a person they had not met. That is the faith the Bible is asking for. Not more certainty, not more feeling, not a louder internal voice, a settled trust in a person who has made specific promises and who has a track record of keeping them. And here is the word that changes everything. The word that the performance-based definition of faith almost always drops. The word is times object. Biblical faith is only as strong as its object. This is not a metaphor. This is structural. The ice over a frozen lake may be thin or thick. If it is thin, it does not matter how confident you feel. It does not matter how boldly you stride across it. If the ice is 2 inches thick and the water is 8 feet deep, your faith will not save you. What saves you is thick ice. Conversely, if the ice is 18 inches thick and will hold 2 tons of weight, you can cross it trembling and uncertain and doubled over with anxiety, whispering every prayer you know, and you will get to the other side. Because the ice is sufficient. Your emotional state did not determine the structural integrity of the ice. This is why the Bible's primary concern is never with the quantity or quality of your faith. Its primary concern is always with its direction. Who are you trusting? What have they promised? Is that promise reliable? And the answer the Bible gives to that last question across 66 books, across more than 1,500 years of written history, across dozens of authors who never met each other is relentlessly, insistently, the same. Yes. There is a moment in Mark chapter 9 that should be printed on every piece of paper in every church in the world. A father brings his son to Jesus. The boy has a spirit that has tormented him since childhood, thrown him into fire, into water, convulsing him. The disciples had tried to help and couldn't. And the father says to Jesus, verse 22, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." If you can, he is not sure. He does not know if Jesus has the ability. He is not approaching this with settled interior certainty. He is approaching it with an exhausted, desperate, half-formed hope that maybe this is the person who can finally do something. And Jesus picks up on the times if. He says, verse 23, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And then the Father says the sentence that may be the most honest prayer in the entire New Testament. "I believe. Help my unbelief. Not I believe and I have no doubts. Not I have generated sufficient faith to qualify for your assistance. Not I have silenced every question. I believe. Help my unbelief." Both things. At the same time. In the same sentence. From the same man. In the same moment. And Jesus heals the boy. He does not wait for the Father to resolve the tension. He does not tell him to come back when he has more certainty. He responds to the trust that is there, fractured, afraid, mixed with doubt, and he acts. That is the God the Bible describes. Not a God who grades your faith on the purity of your feelings. A God who responds to the direction of your trust, even when the trust is limping. So here is what the biblical definition of faith actually produces when you receive it properly. It produces rest. Not the rest of someone who has stopped thinking. Not the rest of someone who has suppressed their questions. The rest of someone who has put their weight on something that will hold it. The writer of Hebrews, in chapter 4, uses the image of rest, the same rest God entered after creation, as the destination of faith. You stop straining to generate certainty from the inside. You stop performing belief for an audience. You stop measuring your faith by the volume of your emotions. You find out who God is, what He has actually said, what He has actually promised, and you lean your full weight on that. And this is why, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, faith's author and finisher is not you, it is Jesus. The faith does not originate with your capacity to believe hard enough. It originates with the one who is the most faithful being in the universe, the one who made promises at the cost of his own life and kept every one of them. Your job is not to manufacture faith. Your job is to direct the trust you have, however much, however fractured, however mixed with fear, toward the person who has earned it. I believe. Help my unbelief. That sentence, spoken honestly, is enough. It has always been enough. 2,000 years ago, a word moved from Greek into the vocabulary of a small group of people who were reorganizing their entire lives around a man they believed had walked out of a tomb. Pistis, trust, the kind that acts, the kind that moves, the kind that plants its feet on a promise and says, I am going to live as if this is true, even when I cannot see it, even when it costs me something, even when I am afraid. That word traveled across centuries and oceans and got translated and retranslated until it arrived in your language, wearing a definition it was never supposed to carry. You were told faith was a feeling, a quantity, an interior performance. It is not. It is trust, directed, costly, and aimed at someone who has never once broken a promise. The only question is not whether you have enough of it. The question is where it is pointed.